John Miller knew he was lost for sure when he saw the shadows getting longer between the trees. He looked at his phone again, hoping in vain that it had somehow gotten service out here in the middle of nowhere in the last 5 minutes. But the screen wouldn't show anything because the thick forest wouldn't give him any hints on how to get back to the trailhead. At the time, it seemed like such a great idea, a last-minute hiking trip on a clear night when he didn't have to study hard for college. He just wanted to get away to the great unknown in the woods near his home. A chance to go on a real trip instead of a virtual one. But now that it was getting dark and the broad trunks were losing their clear shapes and taking on strange personalities in John's mind, he was beginning to wish he hadn't gone on this trip by himself. He walked more slowly and craned his neck in every direction, looking for any sign that might help him remember the way in. He looked around and saw nothing but a sea of trees, their branches reaching out at him like twisted fingers through the growing darkness. He shook, feeling suddenly uncomfortable under their close observation. If only to get more distance between himself and the getting darker, John sped up and chose a random direction to go in. John didn't know how long he stumbled through the woods without knowing where he was going because he was scared and tired. It was getting darker, his pants were wet from shin splints, and he was gasping for air. That was all he knew. He was afraid that he would lose control any time. The sound of each tree breaking sounded eerily like someone was following him around. When he tripped over an exposed root and fell, he yelled and scraped his hands on the rough bark. It was already dark. John was tired and was shaking as he lay on the cold forest floor. There were a lot of clouds in the sky, blocking out even the faint light of the stars. On all sides, complete and utter darkness pressed in, and the only sound was his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He rolled over on his back and fumbled for his phone with numb fingers. The useless device wouldn't answer his silent pleas for help, though. It had been so long since he had felt so alone. Just as John thought his frayed nerves couldn't take it any longer, he caught a glimpse, a tiny light deep in the dead woods out of the corner of his eye. He jumped to his feet and ran toward that faraway promise of rescue, his heart racing with new desperation. "Help!" he yelled into the night. "Please help me, I'm lost." His voice cracked as he stumbled toward the dim light. As he got closer, two small golden orbs became clear, unblinking and distant, even though his tears were making it hard for him to see. John stopped in his tracks, his muscles locked up with sudden fear. From the suffocating darkness, two eyes stared back at him, glowing like dying coals. After that, the real darkness of the forest set in. Before John could even realize what was happening, it started to rain hard, jolting him back to the horrible truth of his situation. He scrambled backwards through the wet undergrowth, shivering violently and drenched to the bone in his thin jacket and pants. He did this to get as far away from those horrible yellow eyes that were still burning a hole in his mind. Where did they go? Were they real, or were they just a crazy dream that his jumbled mind made up? The rose-colored dawn looked like a dream because gunmetal clouds covered the sky and let loose torrents of rain that washed away all signs of his invisible following. John fought to stand up as the stinging rain hit him hard. He was feeling sick from a mix of fear and exhaustion. Which way should I go now? It looked the same in every direction, a thick blur of wet tree limbs slowly disappearing into the rain. Then, as it rained hard, a shimmering light danced somewhere ahead in the wet trees. John's chest swelled with new hope, and with the eyes acting as his heart, he lurched stubbornly toward that faint light. As they came out of a small clearing, they saw the broken-down skeleton of an old hunting house. The walls were caved in and covered in thick, tough moss. But inside, one bulb still lit up fiercely. Finally, safety. John slammed through the rotten door into the musty room, almost going crazy with happiness. He took off all of his wet clothes and laid them out by the weak fireplace. He shivered furiously as he pressed his cold hands to the electric bulb's weak heat. Over time, his numb fingers and toes started to feel again, but it hurt like pinpricks. As his awareness solidified, itchy prickles made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was clear that someone or something had been here not long ago. The old floorboards have new cuts in them, and the rickety table was just moved. John tensed and turned toward sounds coming from deeper inside. There was a wooden opening in the corner with bars that looked like the entrance to hell. It was dirty and had fingerprints that were too big to be human. He twisted it open with all his strength, revealing a small basement storage area that was the source of the sneaky skittering. But among the piled-up food and musty bags, he saw a binder that was full of yellowed newspaper clippings. John pulled it free while his stomach churned at the thought of grainy news stories about unsolved murders and bodies found in these woods with their bodies cut up and a mysterious sign carved into the bark of trees being the only clue. They had thought the sigil before was just an urban tale, but now it looked back at him like a flickering bulb that would never go out. He knew he wasn't alone in the forest, and all of his light and reason went out. Something had been watching and waiting in the pitch-black night. John realized as he slammed the weak door of the cabin shut behind him that following the scary tracks that led from the hidden room like breadcrumbs through hell had been a huge mistake. He knew it wouldn't help much against whatever came through the bush at night and killed those offerings. There was a storm coming. John worked quickly with the weak light from the dying bulb to block the doorway as best he could with the things that were still inside. It was a makeshift defense against the things that go bump in the night. He didn't want to start a fire to stay warm because its light would draw attention to him just as easily from anyone in the trees as the dim light above. As the noise outside grew louder, heavy footsteps squelching through mud, branches breaking under the weight of huge trees, John hid the evidence by pulling up loose floors. Each crash made his heart beat faster and faster. They were on their way. His frantic scraping shook the crumbling walls and removed old layers of grime. Something below sparkled dully in the dying light. A crowbar that wasn't finished, but is ready to be. John finally got his gun and hid deeper in the shadows just as the first blows hit the door frame, shaking it back and forth. The wet wood cracked under the forceful blows. As the opening caved in with a splintering cry, pieces flew everywhere. It poured down rain, and in the distance a tall, stumbling figure could be seen against the darkness. Two round yellow eyes fixed on John as he cowered, his mouth wide open in a wild grin full of sharp teeth. It moved very quickly for its size. Wood screamed as John swung like crazy, and the impact hurt his bones. His attacker fell backwards and slammed into shelves, sending drinks and food flying everywhere. John sprinted up the creaky stairs as soon as he got the chance, hoping to get away from this nightmare. But now that the light was brighter, he could see that it wasn't a scary monster at night. Instead, it was a real person-sized monster with muscles that moved under fur that was knotted. When it got back on its feet, it did so incredibly quickly and looked at him again with that horrible glowing eye. He knew those eyes. The thing seemed to smile from the bottom of the stairs. It said, "Not so fast, little morsel," in a voice that sounded like rocks grinding together. The good times are just getting started. As John scampered up the stairs, it jumped up. His panicked prayers were drowned out by the sound of the old wood cracking. Thunder rolled across the sky above him at the same time as his heart was beating fast. In the end, he was stuck between the ground and the storm, with that gringing teeth snapping at his heels. On the top step, John turned around to face his fate with the crowbar stretched out in front of him. Lightning flashed, casting strobing ghosts across the room in the cabin that had been destroyed. In that electric moment, his eyes locked back on the monsters. And it hit him like thunder. He knew those eyes. From before in the dark forest, looking and waiting. With a sad pop, the bulb went out, plunging them into endless darkness. Somewhere below, heavy footsteps started to climb again in a sad way. When the first pale rays of dawn came through the holes in the walls, they found John lying on the ground, completely worn out and with his crowbar still tightly gripped in his numb fingers. During the long night, the monster must have grown tired of playing with its trapped prey and slunk back into the bush. Right now, it hurt John as he slowly pulled himself up from the dusty floors. It hurt like hell because I had spent another night getting ready for an attack that never came. From the staircase below, he could only hear silence and smell the musty smell of decay. As he slowly made his way down, he was shocked to see that the cabin door was hanging off of one of the hinges in a strange way. Had someone who wasn't following him managed to get away? Or decided to let him go for some other strange reason? It didn't take John long to decide which fate was worse. As soon as I stepped outside, the skeletal remains were hard to see in the bright morning light. Only his desperate tracks, which wound through the clearing, showed what he was going through inside these crumbling walls. John walked after them feeling numb, and came out into the woods again. But now that it was early morning, the trees that were growing closer looked less scary. Birdsong broke the creepy silence as the forest woke up, not knowing or caring about the horrible things going on inside its branches. John kept going, now relying on his weak instincts more than his senses. After a long time or just a few seconds, the trees broke in front of him to reveal a familiar country road. He was so tired and happy that his knees gave out. Along the empty asphalt, lone roofs appeared out of the fog like a welcome mirage. Home. Days went by while John got better with his family watching over him. They smiled and nodded as the safe version of events was told. But when I was alone and quiet, flashes of the past nights came back to me out of the blue. The house, which could be seen through the bushes like a shameful secret, was the scariest thing. And those devilishly familiar eyes would always be there, following his every move no matter how far he ran into the light. In those scary woods,
The real scary stuff had just started. He wondered where they were now, always waiting for the next person to wander off and fall into their hands.
For John, the trees and their silence would no longer bring him comfort or excitement. He still had a bad feeling that going back into the bush by himself might seal his fate and bring about a darkness that no one can escape. Because somewhere deep in those endless trunks lived a nightmare that was always on the lookout for the outsider it had let go of for now. The end, or maybe just the start. It looked like the road through the thick bush would never end. The battered pickup truck shook as it went over the bumpy dirt road. Tall pine and oak trees towered over it, their branches intertwining high above like grasping fingers blocking out the dull gray sky. As he drove, David kept his eyes on the window and used the few faded signs nailed crookedly to tree trunks to help him find his way. There it was. After being alone on the path for more than an hour, a small wooden cabin could be seen in the distance. It was sitting quietly by itself, far from any signs of people or things, as David had hoped to find after everything that had happened. He stopped the truck and went outside. As he took in his new surroundings, he breathed in the rich smells of wet earth and pine needles. He didn't expect the house to be so small. It had brown paint that was peeling off and a rusty metal roof. Dry moss stuck to the walls between pieces of broken wood. On the front, there was only one window that looked out like an empty eye. David went up to the door and turned the knob. It was unlocked, just like the real estate agent said it would be. He squeaked it open and looked inside. The inside wasn't very fancy, but it worked fine. A simple table and chairs made of wood, a worn-out couch, and a stove with a pot belly for heat. There were stiff covers on the bed in the corner room. It looked bad, but David planned to stay there for a few weeks while he got his life together. Much better than being sat in an empty house in town where memories keep coming back to haunt you. David got to work bringing his few bags of food and materials from the truck inside. Thoughts that were bothering him kept coming back to him, even though he was busy with things like unpacking canned goods and piling firewood. Picture her with him, and see how sad she looked as she told him it was over. It all took place so quickly. Under the thick forest, night fell quickly. David lit the pot-bellied stove on fire and sat down with a can of beans next to it to watch the flames dance across the walls of the house. Outside, it got darker in the woods. The only sound in the heavy quiet was an owl hooting far away. David then saw it, a strange yellowish glow that went deep into the trees and was hard to see through the windows. It didn't move. It looked like it was floating among the black trees. But as far as he knew, there were no lights outside. He looked again after rubbing his eyes, but it was gone. David thought it had to be the brightness of the fire playing tricks on his tired mind. He was ready to rest and forget about his problems, even if it was just for the night. Is that so? But it wasn't easy to fall asleep. David was sure he could hear things outside through the thin walls. He kept hearing faint rustlings and crunches that might have been animals or something else. He told himself that it was all in his head and that he had too many bad thoughts and was alone too much. Eventually, he fell into a fitful sleep because he was so tired. The next morning, David went outside and carefully looked around the edges of the small area, but nothing was left of what had made the sounds or lights the night before. Only leaves pushed around by the wind and small claw marks in the ground, most likely from a fox or raccoon. Whatever it was no longer there. David told himself not to worry and jump around so much about nothing. The trip was meant to help him forget, not make things worse. But the more time he spent alone in the remote cabin, the more uneasy he felt about things that had nothing to do with past pain. 3 nights later, the strange light in the woods came back. David was reading by a lamp when he noticed movement in the corner of his eye. He looked up and saw the same dull yellow glow hanging in the woods far away, as if it were calling him. David looked at it with anger. This wasn't just a light or tired mind trick. There was something out there that showed itself to him on purpose every night. David got up early the next morning because he couldn't sleep. A light mist hung low over the forest floor as he searched for signs around the edges of the small clearing. At that moment, he saw the strange tracks that went around the whole cabin, as if something had crept up on them during the night. David bent down to look at them more closely. The prints were long and deep, and the animal's 4 spread-out toes were not like any he knew. Considering the size, the space between each picture was way too long. What was scariest was that the prints looked like they were glowing lightly when they were on the wet ground. David shook and rubbed his eyes in shock, but the prints were still there, a clear sign of a ghostly presence that was haunting him alone. David began to notice other small changes as the days went by. There were strange sounds coming from the woods all the time, like someone was watching him while he slept. Never far away. When he got too close to the tree line, the calls of birds and insects stopped all of a sudden, and there was an unnatural quiet. It looked like the forest was making everything darker, even the sunshine that was coming through the trees. David tried to keep his mind off of things by working and fixing up parts of the house that were falling apart. But every night when it got dark, the woods outside seemed to come to life, and he could tell that eyes were watching him through the windows. David thought he saw a wavy shadow dart between the trees one time. Even though it was getting hotter, he started locking all the doors and windows at night.
There was more glow in the clearing tonight than ever before.
Behind the thick shades, David could see more details against the black trees in the background. The light flickered in a strange way, like it came from a flickering mass floating in the air. It moved slowly left and right, as if taking its time to look at the house, which was only a yard or two from the trees. David knew that he had to end this scary game of cat and mouse for good. He slammed the front door open and marched into the misty night with determined steps toward the light, pulling a flashlight and a hunting knife from his packs. He wouldn't stop until he found out who or what was terrorizing them all the time. But when David shined his flashlight into the thick bush, the yellow glow was gone as quickly as it had come on. David was angry because he couldn't see anything in the pitch-black trunks. All he could see were more barely glowing prints that led into the darkness. Something that lived in these woods was always one step ahead, which made David feel even more afraid than before. That night, a very loud storm ripped through the forest, trapping David inside the shaky shack. Through windows that rattled, he saw the dark shapes of trees sway fiercely, their branches flailing around as if they were fighting demons in the strong winds. Strong winds slashed at the old building, threatening to tear it apart at the joints. David kept lighting the oil lamp inside every time it went out because he didn't want to be completely in the dark. In some way, the cage made me feel even more trapped and suspicious than the storm outside.
There was a scary edge to every shadow on the wall.
Strange sounds coming from below the storm made David jump at the smallest groan or creak. His mind was racing. The rain turned into a heavy drizzle when dawn finally came. But the woods around them were different.
There was a dark, scary feeling in the air under the wet leaves, as if the storm had stirred up a primordial evil.
David went outside slowly, climbing over twisted roots and muddy puddles to get to the spot where he had last seen the strange light. Soon, David saw signs that there had been recent damage in the reaching trunks. A few trees were bent out of shape, and the bark had been shaved off in long strips down the sides, letting sap drip like blood. Patches of plants were lying flat, as if they had been stomped on by a huge object. All of them pointed to the same place deeper in the scary forest. As David moved forward, he saw more strange things that made him feel even worse.
There was wet clay that was as red as raw meat on the forest floor where a big piece had been clawed away.
Feathers were flying around in the dull air. They were all that was left of a target animal that had been violently torn apart. He saw that something had dug a big, misshapen hole in the muddy ground and was sleeping or burrowing there, keeping a horrible watch over the woods from this unholy den. A stringy strand of saliva hung from a low branch. It had a thick shine that made David's tummy turn. He carefully wiped it off with a stick and held it up to look at how frighteningly human-like the texture was. It was very clear in my mind that I remembered the strange pictures and sounds. This could not have been done by a normal animal. This forest was marked by something huge and evil as its original home, and it was now focused on the lone person who was breaking its rules. Then, out of the strange silence came a blood-curdling screech that broke David's thoughts. It came from everywhere, like the forest was screaming in pain. He quickly turned around, flashing his flashlight over the tall trees. For a split second, he was sure he saw an oddly shaped shadow move too quickly along the edges of his vision. He felt his blood run cold when he realized that something had been watching him the whole time. David quickly turned around and ran away, plunging through sharp branches and clinging vines on his way back to the safety of the house. No safe place could hide the truth that was beating in his head. Whatever was hiding in those untamed woods was much stronger and more dangerous than any person, and it would do anything to get back its territory and the invader inside. Now that he was stuck alone with a darkness that was even stranger than the storm, he was completely at its mercy. Once the rain stopped, the nights got longer and darker, making the forest feel like it was outside of time. David didn't dare close his eyes for more than a few seconds at a time inside the empty house. His nerves were so stressed that every sound, like old wood creaking or leaves rustling outside, made him feel scared. He kept any source of light on and his tools close by, ready for the final, terrifying fight he knew was coming. The thing had stopped being careful about where it hid and was now just hanging around. It was always dark outside, but you could hear heavy footsteps and the snapping of trees under huge weights. David thought he saw a huge shape backlit by the woods one time, which made his heart skip a beat in fear. It was slowly closing the net around its prey, pushing them to the point where they would break. David had horrible hallucinatory dreams during the few times he was able to get some rest. He was dragged into the dark spaces between the trees by clawed hands. Monster eyes made of amber looking out of the forest haze. Always the same strange screaming that seemed to shake his bones and had an evil sound that no human throat could make. David knew he couldn't take the siege any longer when dawn finally broke on the fourth night. As his strength and supplies were running out, he waited for any signs of movement to stop before going out into the dark half-light and carefully walking back to where he had last seen the growing den. Thankfully, there were no sounds to accompany his shaky steps through the dead woods. But the twisted trees looked closer than they had before, with branches all around that were turning into scary shapes. David's anxiety grew with every beating heartbeat because of the constant movement in his peripheral vision. He finally found the horrible pit among the wet ferns. He gulped down sickness and stretched his ears as he waited for the killer to show itself. In the middle of the thick quiet, there was a bone-chilling screech that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then, up ahead, between the trees that reached out, David caught a glimpse of a huge, misshapen shape that quickly and gracefully emerged from the shadows. Amber's eyes were the size of dinner plates and were locked on him with a mean look. Her jaws were longer than a man and had sharp teeth that were dripping saliva. The horrible thing screamed again and ran on all fours, getting closer too fast for David to respond. He threw a lit flare into the monster's mouth as it sucked in air, which made an ear-splitting howl that shook the primordial trees to their very cores. David turned and ran through the bush, but he couldn't see where he was going. As he ran, branches hit his flailing arms and legs. Just as the thing hit the walls, he crashed through the cabin door. There was an explosion of splintered wood and anger. Just in time, David slammed the broken door shut against the hits, passing out from shock amidst the terrible sounds of the hunter's rage. When dawn finally broke through, David woke up in a feverish state to an unsettling quiet. He moved the things that were blocking the doorway out of the way and looked outside. He couldn't believe that the area was once again empty, with no signs of the chaos from the night before. The faintly glowing tracks going back into the primordial depths were the only signs. They were a grim warning that there were some secrets in those old woods that were better left undiscovered. David packed up his few things with shaky hands, determined to stay as far away from this place of unholy terror as possible. That evil would let him stay in its territory was still something that was unknown. But one thing was clear, some darknesses could never be escaped, they could only be lived with a shaking soul from afar. When Adam got to the out-of-the-way house, it was already dark. He turned off the engine and cautiously looked through the glass at the shape that was coming closer. Its walls were empty and dark, with not a single light shining inside. Adam's doubts grew as he packed his bags. He could feel the heavy weight of being alone weighing on him. Even though he chose this alone trip to disconnect, the crushing vastness around him started to feel deep. Adam stumbled around in the dark until he found the heavy door and pushed it open. As he looked around his temporary home, the beams of his phone light showed dust dancing. The small space was filled with stripped-down furniture that didn't offer any comforts, just a clean place to hide from the risks outside. In the main room, a single hanging bulb flickered overhead, creating a weak glow that didn't do much to keep the shadows from getting too close. Adam tried the switches, but they didn't work. He was once again in the dark. His fingers were moving quickly across the phone as he sent a message to the host about the power problems, hoping that they would answer quickly. There was only quiet. Adam sighed and started unpacking the few food items he had brought, eager to take his mind off of things. When I opened the cabinets, I saw that the previous owners had left few things behind. A half-full bottle of water, a can of beans, and tea bags made up the cupboard. Clearly, not many people stayed here, and it didn't offer much either. As soon as Adam sat down on the lumpy couch, a loud knocking sound could be heard throughout the house. With his heart in his mouth, he hesitantly crossed to the door and peered out into the dark. "Hello?" A worn-out figure appeared in front of him, coming out of the darkness like a ghost. The bones in their faces were bent into a smile that might have been meant to be friendly but came across as grimacing. "Evening. I'm the owner, name's Talbot. Here yous having electrical troubles." His voice was rough, like rusty doors swinging open, and it made Adam's nerves hurt. Adam had never seen Talbot's teeth so big, but his eyes had a disturbing void that made him feel more uneasy than any growl could. As politely as he could, Adam told the man what was wrong while watching his eyes roam around the room, hungry for information. Talbot slowly nodded. as if his mind was somewhere else. Reckon the old generator must be on the fritz again. I'll have a look-see. He walked right past Adam and into the cabin without waiting to be invited.
Adam cautiously followed Talbot while keeping his distance as he began his quick inspection. The big man rummaged through closets and peered under furniture, stirring up dust and cobwebs as he did so.
He was also mumbling something that no one could understand. When Talbot got out from under the sink after a few minutes of grunting, he wiped his dirty hands on his grease-stained pants. "Ain't nothing I can do tonight, I'm afraid.
Generator's on its last legs, needs parts I ain't got. Reckon you'll just have to rough it till morning.
I'll swing by first light with a replacement." Adam looked around at the dark, isolating shadows and felt very alone as his words didn't help much. Talbot's noticeable lack of a car also made them feel uneasy because it reminded them how far away help was in case something went wrong. Adam thanked the man and nodded, eager to see him go. But Talbot stood by the door for a while, as if he had forgotten something. He was rocking back and forth in his worn-out work boots while his face furrowed in that unsettling, empty way.
Are you going to stay for a long time?
Adam thought the question was odd and rude for a first meeting. He gave a bland answer, just a few nights, hoping that was enough. Talbot slowly ate this, his eyes never leaving Adam's face like beetles.
There was a nervous moment before the owner smiled again, this time in a way that seemed almost predatory.
"Okay, now you be careful. Enjoy the quiet and peace." With that threatening goodbye, Talbot swung open the creaking door and disappeared into the night, leaving Adam feeling very alone. He double-checked the locks and locked all the windows because the man's obvious strangeness and his prowling at night scared him.
There was something wrong with Talbot and this place.
He was so tired that he was leaning against the wall, and the phone light flickered across his face. Outside, Adam felt a chill go down his spine as he heard a mysterious rustling coming from the growing forest. What or who was hiding behind the weak bulb's light? He had come to these wild woods to be alone, but all he found was more and more uneasiness. This night it would be hard to fall asleep. As the last rays of twilight went out of sight, blackness fell over the cabin. Adam sat tensely by the bulb that was flickering and reading the same passage over and over again without understanding it. His thoughts were not on the pages at all. They kept going back to looking out into the pitch-black space beyond the thin walls. Adam looked dirty as the first pale rays of dawn came in through dirty windows and lit up his face.
He had only gotten a few hours of sleep because he woke up at the slightest sound and scanned the room in a crazy state of anxiety. In his jumbled mind, shadows and made-up threats were everywhere. Adam woke up from his sleepy state when he heard noise outside. Fear gripped him right away. He slowly made his way to the window, his body aching for rest but high on energy. As I looked into the dimming darkness, nothing stood out among the crooked tree branches. Was it a dream caused by not getting enough sleep? His attention was drawn lower, where the green grass slowly split apart. Glancing at him with eyes that looked like they were hunting, they slithered back into cover. Adam gasped for air in fear and fell backwards from the window pane. They were still out there, watching for any sign of weakness like hawks. That made things clear. There is no place to hide or sleep here because there are demons at the door. Adam sighed and grabbed his bag and phone. He checked to make sure the phone was useless before putting it away. He threw open the cabin door and ran straight into the thick forest, covering as much ground as his strong legs could take him. Angry tree branches slashed at each other, grabbing clothes and skin alike. Snapping twigs and rustling undergrowth echoed his terrified run, making every mistake he made more obvious to anyone sneakily following him. Adam swatted away spider webs and swung his huge body through thickets, not caring where the road led as long as it led to safety. Adam kept fighting hard, even though he was tired and scared, and sweat and tears were running down his face. Lungs burned from breathing quickly, and legs hurt and complained every yard they went into the wilds that didn't care. But stopping meant giving in to the nameless predators who had trapped him in this nightmare. The things that were chasing him out of sight, not sound, could only be stopped by steady movement. Adam didn't know how long he had been flying through the treeless forest. In this race for life, time stopped being important. Putting one foot in front of the other into the unknown was all that mattered. Finally, blessed sunlight broke through the mist as he stumbled out of the trees and onto an empty stretch of cracked blacktop. Adam fell to his knees and retched fiercely as his muscles screamed for more oxygen. He turned around quickly to look at the tree line, scared that wild animals would jump out from behind the trees at any time. But all he could see were swaying trees. There was no longer any sign of predators waiting for the right time. As Adam's power slowly came back, he shakily got to his feet and pulled out his phone with shaking hands. Still, no signal came back to his hopeful swipes.
In these tough times, this device is as useful as Tinder.
He didn't know which way to go to get help because he was stuck on this empty stretch of land under a clear sky.
His car was still somewhere outside those trees, and the keys were lost in the chaos of the flight. Adam felt more like breaking down than at any other time because he was stuck and alone, and bad things were still hiding somewhere out of sight. He kept going down the lonely path even though his body hurt because his survival reflexes kicked in.
Going forward held more hope than going back into the dangerous arms of that unnatural forest. Adam fell asleep for hours as he walked mile after tired mile, his arms around him to keep them warm against the cold.
Still, the endless rows of trees stood like guardians on either side, not letting anyone leave their territory.
His feet were bleeding freely, and with each heavy step forward into the hot afternoon, his legs seemed ready to rebel.
Heat stroke and a lack of hope took what little strength was left, and the person was getting close to giving up. Then, while he was still feeling very tired, he noticed movement ahead of him. A dirty pickup truck came around a corner and slowly made its way toward him.
Adam waved wildly and held back tears of relief as the tires came to a stop.
Soon, strong arms pulled his weak body inside to the cool air conditioning, finally waking him up from this bad dream. It didn't matter where or how far they went, they just had to get out of that dark forest and away from all the scary things that lived in its twisted heart. Sometimes a strange sound would break the quiet, which made him jump out of his chair and slam hard against the window. But at night the crooked tree roots made it hard to see any signs of life or movement. Still, he felt like eyes were watching him from behind, paying close attention to every tiny movement inside the house. The silence was broken by a rough howl that was too close to be safe. More voices joined in, and Adam's heart got stuck in his throat. The tiny clearing was filled with the sound of eerie voices. As he quickly searched through his phone's apps for even a single bar, he grabbed it from the table. But, as before, his search turned up nothing but an endless void. The device was just as useless against the forces of the night as he was. Adam sighed and sank back into his chair, trying to hear anything outside the weak door. The lonely background noise was made up of crickets and owls, with scary cracklings and rustling coming from the thick forest. Each passing moment of sounds he couldn't understand carried on the wind made the pictures in his mind scarier. What kind of animals were coming so close in the dark? Could Talbot be stalking the outside right now? His eyes sparkling with hunger in the bushes? Adam's paranoia grew, making him more afraid until it seemed like every shadow was a threat. The thin blanket was pulled closer around him, and all he could think about was dawn and answers outside these walls. Time moved so slowly that minutes seemed like hours in the smothering silence. Then, out of the blue, a huge beating hit the cabin from outside, shaking the old wood. Adam yelled and jumped up, his heart beating faster than before. The door kept getting hit hard, like by a battering ram, which kept shaking dust off the ceiling. Rushing sounds joined the chaos, as if some animal was scratching and clawing desperately to get inside. Adam slid backwards in fear, holding out his phone as the only weak defense against the dreams coming from outside. The noise got louder and louder, an unholy serenade of anger and hunger calling for people to come into his haven. Adam was so scared that he couldn't do anything but watch as the door bucked inward with each blow, almost giving way from the constant pressure. He was scared and gasped for air, waiting for the weak barrier to break apart at any moment and let out whatever evil force was outside. He wanted so badly to just disappear into the floors and get away from this nightmare that was happening in the middle of the night. The beating stopped just as quickly as it had begun. Adam stood still as a rock, barely daring to breathe for fear of waking up the sleeping beast again. After a painful time, there was no sound coming from outside the hut walls. The only sounds that broke the deep silence were his rough breaths and thundering heartbeat. Adam took a tentative look out the window and saw blurry figures disappearing into the darkness and becoming part of the night. He couldn't tell if they were people or animals, and their leaving didn't make him feel better. His phone still wouldn't let him call for help, which made him feel even more alone and vulnerable. While monsters lurked just outside the weak walls, sleep would not come. Adam huddled in his chair against the corner and held his phone up to his ear like a charm. He prayed that the break of dawn would drive these evil spirits away. It didn't get any better when midnight came, making the cage deeper like a suffocating tomb. Every creak and noise brought back his fear, taking him back to that moment of complete terror as he waited for destruction from an evil he couldn't know. Around the witching hour, he finally fell asleep from being so tired. But in his dream world, darker shadows came in and chased him through a crumbling forest house over and over again. When Adam woke up before dawn, he was drenched in cold sweat and found that there was silence once more beyond the walls that were covering him. Are the things he couldn't name also at rest, or did they follow him around in his mind like the woods? Dawn seemed like it would never come. Adam fell asleep while watching strange scenery pass by the windows. The rumbling diesel engine put him to sleep. When they became aware again, it was getting dark, and the truck was stopped outside of a roadside diner that was lit up by neon lights. Hank, a rough-looking cowboy who saved him, gently woke him up and helped him hobble inside. While eating burgers and drinking coffee, Adam talked about the scary events that had made him so crazy, trying to make sense of things that were beyond his understanding. Hank listened carefully and chewed slowly as the puzzle pieces came together. "Son, it sounds like you caused a problem that should have been left alone in those woods. Take it from me, some places aren't meant for people." Soon after Adam's desperate phone call finally reached someone, police came. He told the cops everything they needed to know, including Talbot's strange behavior and the attacks on the cabin at night. The police officers traded uneasy looks. It was clear that the disturbing story was bothering them, but they didn't have any solid proof of wrongdoing. "We need to check out that place and see what we can find. Hold on tight with Hank until we find out more, okay? Get some rest." Before leaving into the night, one of the uniforms smiled in a reassuring way, and Hank joined them to help them find their way along the unknown trails. Adam couldn't fall asleep, though, because his mind kept repeating those brief images of hungry eyes watching him from the bushes. When dawn came, there had been no word from the police, which made him even more worried. He quickly became tired, and finally fell asleep in the truck, where he could escape into dreamless darkness. When he became aware again, Hank woke him up with excitement. "Dude, the police just told us over the radio that they found something." Adam slowly walked after the rancher's loping gait. He was filled with fear as he thought about the new horrors that were about to come out. A police car sat still outside the cabin clearing as they came out from behind the trees. Inside, police officers sifted through prints and took pictures of the empty building. Someone said, "It looks like someone's been squatting here lately," pointing out the disturbed dust and shelves that had just been filled with canned goods. At first glance, the place looked like it was empty, but cleverly hidden signs of recent activity showed that it had been inhabited. Back in the woods, more officers carefully searched the tree line. "Voice, officer, look at these strange marks," a voice said. When Adam and Hank walked over, they saw deep cuts in the ground and scrapes on nearby tree branches that reached high into the air. He had never seen an animal that was so tall or left such intentional marks. Even stranger groups of symbols had been carefully placed nearby, and strange geometric patterns had been carefully carved into the soft ground. Their meaning stayed completely unclear, which made them even more unsettling. The ominous mood was made even worse by Talbot's strange disappearance and the uncanny feeling that people were watching them from all sides. Since there didn't seem to be any clear answers, the police took Adam back to town so he could answer more questions at the station. During questioning, his story didn't change. The facts started to fit, but the motive and the people responsible stayed elusive. In the end, everyone agreed that common sense should have been used. There were some riddles that were better left unsolved than to be dug up in the middle of nowhere. He got away with his life, at least. As night fell again, Adam was dropped off at Hank's house by a squad car. Hank agreed to lend Adam a deputy to follow him back to the city when the sun came up. As the cruiser's headlights went out, Adam looked back somberly at the shape of the forest on the horizon. As before, shadows seemed to move and swirl in the Stygian void, but he couldn't tell what was watching. Who or what was really hiding among those twisted trees was still unknown in the dark night.